Say the letter R out loud, right now. Feel what your mouth does. Feel where your tongue goes. Feel the shape your throat makes. If you're American, your tongue probably curled backward, the tip lifting toward the roof of your mouth without touching it, producing a smooth, rounded, vowel-like sound that barely qualifies as a consonant. If you're British, your tongue may have done even less, a slight modification of the vowel before it, a ghost of a sound that in many positions isn't really there at all. If you're Australian, the R may have vanished entirely into the vowel, a memory of a consonant rather than the consonant itself. Now listen to a Scotsman say the letter R. Listen to a Spaniard. Listen to an Italian, an Arab, a Russian, a Finn, a speaker of Hindi or Swahili or Japanese. Listen to the sound they make. The rapid, percussive, vibrating contact between the tip of the tongue and the ridge behind the upper teeth. The trill, the roll. The sound that the letter R represented in every language that used the Latin alphabet for over 2,000 years before something happened to it in English. Something that changed not just how a letter was pronounced, but how the human vocal apparatus was used, how the body's relationship to speech was structured, and how an entire civilization's capacity for a specific physical act was, within a few generations, almost entirely lost. The English R died, not metaphorically, not gradually over millennia in the way that sounds normally shift in living languages. Within a historically identifiable window, roughly 1700 to 1800, the English-speaking world lost the ability to produce the trilled R that had been the standard pronunciation of the letter for the entire previous history of the language. The loss was so complete that most English speakers alive today cannot produce the sound at all without specific training. A sound that every English speaker made in 1650 is physically impossible for most English speakers in 2025. A basic human vocal capability, the ability to trill the tip of the tongue against the alveolar ridge, has been bred out of the English-speaking population in roughly 10 generations. I need you to sit with the speed of that, because sounds do change in languages. Pronunciation evolves. The Great Vowel Shift transformed English vowels over a period of roughly 300 years. But vowel shifts don't eliminate a motor skill. They modify one sound into another sound produced by the same basic mechanism. The loss of the trilled R is different. It's the loss of a specific neuromuscular coordination. The ability to vibrate the tongue tip rapidly against a fixed point, a skill that requires specific muscle development, specific neural pathways, specific motor patterns established during the critical period of language acquisition. A skill that, once lost from the linguistic environment, disappears from the population's physical repertoire within a generation because children who don't hear the sound don't develop the motor pattern to produce it. This raises a simple but critical question. What happened between 1700 and 1800 that killed the English R? The official explanation is sound change, the natural, inevitable evolution of pronunciation that affects every living language. English R underwent a process linguists call derhoticization, the weakening and eventual loss of the rhotic consonant in certain positions. The trilled R weakened to a tapped R, a single brief contact rather than a sustained vibration. The tap weakened to an approximant, the curled tongue non-contact sound that American English uses today. The approximant weakened to 0 in non-rhotic dialects, the British and Australian pattern where the R simply disappears after vowels. Each stage represents a reduction in articulatory effort. Each stage produces a sound that is easier to make than the one before. The tongue does less. The mouth works less. the path of least resistance produced the modern R. And that explanation is phonetically accurate. The sequence of changes is well documented. The trajectory from trill to tap to approximate to zero follows a pattern observed in other languages. The mechanics of the change are understood, but the deeper I went, the more I found that the mechanics don't explain the timing, because the trilled R had been stable in English for centuries. Old English had it. Middle English had it. Early modern English, the language of Shakespeare, had it. Shakespeare's actors trilled their R's. The audiences at the Globe Theatre heard a trilled R in every word that contained one. The sound was stable, persistent, maintained across generations of English speakers through every other sound change the language underwent, and then, in a window of roughly 100 years, it vanished. Sound changes don't happen overnight. But they don't usually happen in a century either, unless something accelerates them. Something environmental, something social, something that changes the conditions under which the sound is transmitted from one generation to the next. The silence was deafening when I started looking for the accelerant. As if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. Here's what changed between 1700 and 1800 in how English was spoken and transmitted. The rise of prescriptive grammar. The standardization of English pronunciation by self-appointed authorities who published dictionaries, grammars, and pronunciation guides that told the English-speaking public how they should speak rather than describing how they did speak. The elocution movement, the codification of received pronunciation, the emergence of a class-based hierarchy of speech in which certain sounds were deemed correct and others were deemed vulgar. The trilled R was deemed vulgar. Go read the elocution manuals of the 1700s, the pronouncing dictionaries, the guides to correct English speech that were published in London and distributed to the aspiring middle class that was desperate to sound like the upper class that was desperate to sound like it had never been anything else. The trilled R, the rolling, vibrating, muscular sound that every English speaker had produced for centuries, was associated with the lower classes, with rural speech, with Scots and Irish dialects that the London establishment considered barbarous. The smooth, non-trilled R, the sound that required less effort and less muscular engagement, was associated with refinement, with education, with the effortless superiority that the English class system used as its primary marker of social position. The deeper I went into the social history of pronunciation, the more the death of the trilled R started to look less like a natural sound change and more like a social engineering project. Because the elocution movement of the 1700s wasn't just describing how pronunciation was changing. It was prescribing how pronunciation should change. The manuals didn't say the R is becoming smoother. They said the R should be smoother. They taught the smooth R. They drilled it. They corrected the trill. They told students that the trill was wrong, low, common, and that the smooth sound was right, elevated, proper. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across every aspect of English pronunciation that was standardized during this period. Because the trilled R wasn't the only sound that was targeted. The elocution movement systematically identified sounds associated with lower-class and regional speech and replaced them with sounds associated with the London elite. The process didn't just change pronunciation, it created a hierarchy of sound, a system in which the way you spoke revealed your class, your education, your geographic origin, and your fitness for social advancement. And the trilled R, the sound that marked you as Scottish or Irish or rural or working class, was one of the primary targets. Here's where the thread connects to something physiological. Because the trilled R isn't just a sound, it's a physical act, a motor skill, a coordination pattern that engages specific muscles of the tongue, specific neural circuits in the motor cortex, specific respiratory patterns that coordinate airflow with tongue vibration. The trill requires the tongue to vibrate at approximately 25 to 30 hertz. It requires the intrinsic muscles of the tongue to maintain a specific tension, while the extrinsic muscles position the tongue tip at the alveolar ridge. It requires a specific airflow pressure to initiate and sustain the vibration. This motor pattern is not trivial. It's complex, and it develops during the critical period of language acquisition, roughly the first 6 years of life, when the neural circuits for speech production are being established. Children who hear the trilled R in their linguistic environment develop the motor pattern to produce it. Children who don't hear it don't develop it. And once the critical period closes, acquiring the motor pattern becomes exponentially more difficult. This is why adult English speakers struggle to produce a trilled R when learning Spanish or Italian. The motor pattern wasn't established during the window when it could have been. The neural circuitry wasn't built. The physical capability was never developed. The deeper I went into the motor neuroscience of speech production, the more the loss of the trilled R started to look like a loss of physical capability, not just a change in preferred sound. Every generation of English speakers since the elocution movement has raised children in a linguistic environment that doesn't contain the trilled R. Those children don't develop the motor pattern. They grow up physically unable to produce the sound. They raise their own children in the same environment. Their children are also physically unable. The loss compounds. The motor capability atrophies across the population. And within a few generations, a sound that every human being can theoretically produce, that children in trilling languages produce effortlessly by age 4, becomes something that adult English speakers experience as physically impossible. The human vocal apparatus didn't change, the tongue didn't evolve, the alveolar ridge didn't move. The anatomy is identical to the anatomy that produced the trill for centuries. What changed was the environment, the social environment that determined which sounds children heard and therefore which motor patterns children developed. The elocution movement didn't just change a pronunciation, it changed the physical capabilities of every subsequent generation of English speakers. Now here's where the investigation took a turn I wasn't expecting. Because the trilled R isn't just a sound, and it isn't just a motor skill. It has physiological effects that go beyond speech production. Go produce a sustained trill. If you can't trill your tongue, hum at the same frequency, roughly 25 to 30 hertz. Feel the vibration. Feel where it resonates. The trill vibrates the hard palate. The hard palate is directly below the nasal cavity. The nasal cavity is directly below the sphenoid sinus. The sphenoid sinus sits at the base of the skull, adjacent to the pituitary gland. The vibration produced by a sustained alveolar trill resonates through the cranial structures in a pattern that is measurably different from the vibration produced by any other speech sound. Pull up the research on the physiological effects of vibration at the frequencies involved in speech. Studies on vibroacoustic therapy have documented that vibrations in the range of 20 to 50 hertz produce measurable effects on the nervous system. Reduced muscle tension, altered brainwave patterns, changes in autonomic nervous system activation. The frequency range of the trilled R falls squarely within the therapeutic range identified in vibroacoustic research. And here's what the ancient traditions that maintained the trilled R had to say about it. Because the trill wasn't just a consonant in the languages that used it. In Sanskrit, the trilled R appears in mantras that are specifically described as having vibrational effects on the body. The rolling R in Sanskrit chanting isn't incidental to the practice, it's functional. The vibration it produces in the oral and nasal cavities is described in the yogic texts as a stimulation of specific energy centers. In the Sufi tradition, specific Arabic phonemes, including the trilled R, are used in dhikr practices specifically for their vibrational quality. The sound isn't just carrying meaning through language, it's carrying vibration through tissue. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across every tradition that maintained vigorous consonant articulation as part of its spiritual or healing practices. The trilled R, the the sustained nasals, the aspirated stops, the sounds that require the most muscular engagement, the most airflow, the most physical involvement of the vocal apparatus, are consistently the sounds that the ancient traditions identify as therapeutically significant, and they are consistently the sounds that the standardization of modern pronunciation has weakened or eliminated. The deeper I went, the more the loss of the trilled R started to look like one piece of a much larger pattern, the systematic reduction of the physical involvement of speech, because the trajectory of English pronunciation over the past 3 centuries has moved consistently in one direction: less muscular engagement, less articulatory effort, less vibration, less physical involvement of the body in the act of speaking. The trill was replaced by a tap. The tap was replaced by an approximant. The approximant was replaced by nothing. Each step reduced the physical engagement. Each step made speech easier, more effortless, more disembodied. A movement of air rather than a vibration of tissue. And the modern epidemic of speech and voice disorders, the tension, the fatigue, the vocal strain that affects an increasing percentage of the population, might not be entirely unrelated to a vocal apparatus that is being used at a fraction of its designed capacity, a tongue that evolved to trill and that now barely contacts the palate, a respiratory system designed to support sustained vocal vibration and that now pushes air past passive articulators. An entire vocal mechanism operating in a state of chronic underengagement that no speech therapist addresses by saying, use your tongue more vigorously, because the concept that the tongue is supposed to vibrate has been culturally erased. I'm not telling you the trilled R was a healing sound. I'm telling you it was a physical act that engaged the vocal apparatus at a level of intensity that the modern English R doesn't approach. That the loss of this act corresponded to a social engineering project in 18th century England that targeted specific sounds for elimination based on class prejudice. That the elimination removed a motor skill from the English-speaking population within a few generations. That the motor skill involved vibration at frequencies documented to have physiological effects. That every ancient tradition that maintained the trilled R described it in terms that went beyond linguistics into therapeutics. I'm asking what your mouth was supposed to do that it no longer does. What vibrations your skull was supposed to carry that it no longer carries. What motor patterns your tongue was supposed to develop in childhood that the linguistic environment you were raised in prevented from forming. What the English R sounded like when Shakespeare spoke it, when the King James Bible was read aloud for the first time, when every English speaker on earth could roll their tongue against the roof of their mouth and feel the vibration resonate through the bones of their face. I'm asking what was lost when an elocution teacher in Georgian London decided that the sound your ancestors had made for 1,000 years was vulgar.